Hello and welcome to Alaska's Political Pipeline. I'm political reporter Will Courtney, and sitting down alongside me, JKT, former state lawmaker Jonathan Kreiss-Tomkins. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you today. We're talking to all the candidates a little bit about themselves, some of the top policy issues on the ballot this year. So let's start from the beginning. Why do you want to run for governor?
I feel like the last 8 years under our current governor have been, frankly, a failure, kind of a dumpster fire for Alaska. Just all the indicators feel like our state is going in the wrong direction. And I want to turn that around. And I believe in problem solving and working together. That was very much my approach in the legislature. And I feel like we have been absolutely missing that in the governor's office the last 8 years. And
yeah,
I want to sort of change that equation.
What was the moment you decided that you needed to run for governor?
To be honest, I thought there was a very good chance Mary Peltola was going to run for governor, as did many of us in Alaska, or we're sort of wondering where she was going to go. And when it became clear that Mary wasn't and was going to seek federal office, that's when the gears started to turn.
Yeah. And that's interesting you said that, because I remember interviewing Tom Begich, who's the other Democrat running for this seat, and he had a similar remark. Tell me a little bit about Mary Peltola's role in Alaska, especially as a Democrat. Is she essentially the leader of Democrats in Alaska?
I think she's the standard bearer. I mean, she won 2 statewide elections. You know, she's the last Democrat to win a statewide election. I have a lot of respect for her personally. I first worked with Mary on fisheries issues well before she ran for Congress, and I was working on fisheries issues as a legislator with a rural, very fisheries-centric district, and she was living out in Bethel, working on Kuskokwim salmon issues, and got to know her, really like her, and I think with somebody with her resume and success, it's you really just want to follow her lead.
Yeah, and Alaska is in an interesting place. A lot of people just go into different coffee shops and whatnot, call it purple. I mean, if you look at the delegation, it's red. If you look at the governor, it's red. But certainly, it's different conversation in the state legislature. Where do you kind of see the state? Do you think it's purple? And then my second question is, what does it mean to be a Democrat in this state when there's a lot of Republicans?
I think Alaska is an independent state, and if nothing else, Lisa Murkowski is independent-minded. I don't agree with every vote she might take, although I do with many as well. But I think she thinks for herself and acts on her own accord. Mary was in the delegation for 2 years. She's a Democrat. Dan Sullivan, Nick Begich are a little bit more in the sort of Trump lane of Republican politics. But you look at the legislature, there's D's and I's and R's all holding gavels, running committees. So I think we have a very blended politics, and it's hard to kind of simplify it just to it's this party.
Going back to your race for governor, you're a former state lawmaker. You were in for 8 years, you said?
10 years.
10 years. So, especially 8 years with the governor, I follow.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how that experience as a legislator really translates over to becoming the governor.
I think it's helpful. You know how state government works. You know how things work. That's obviously essential knowledge if you're going to be the chief executive. It's also a way to really get to know Alaska beyond, just where you're from or your own personal experiences. I mean, Juneau, as you know, you have sort of people from every corner of Alaska, from every industry or sector coming there over the course of 4 months for session. And it's like an all-you-can-eat learning buffet. I mean, you're really, you meet people from Kotzebue and the YK and people with tobacco cessation background to the mining industry. And you do that for 10 years and you learn a lot about how the state works and what people care about. And I feel like that was incredibly valuable for me.
Yeah, you called this administration a dumpster fire. I mean, I think is that fair?
Yes,
Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you think the state needs when it comes to executive leadership?
Well, just to sort of speak to what I see as the problems, the smoldering dumpster fire, as it were. Our schools are in the worst place I can remember in my life, and I think people older than me, Alaskans older than me, will say the same. To the point that I know families who are questioning whether they can stay in Alaska because they've lost confidence in the quality of the schools that their kids are going to. And that's just cornerstone institution for a state to work is you have to have good schools. So that's gone down the tubes. I'm from coastal Alaska. I have a rural Alaska background. The ferry system basically is a shell of what it once was. It basically does not really function for most intents and purposes. I feel like our fisheries management are upside down. I feel like the trawl industry has had undue influence on the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. Bycatch of Chinook and chum salmon, as well as halibut, I think are at levels that are, far more elevated than most Alaskans feel comfortable with. So it's sort of like everywhere you look, it feels like there's a problem, and the sum effect of it is people are leaving, and that really feels like the blinking red warning light that Alaska is going in the wrong direction. For me, I think like the solution is to work with the legislature to solve problems, and I think that just like that fundamental mindset is so essential, because there, to many of the issues I just discussed, there are bipartisan policy proposals that I think would meaningfully address those problems and sort of reverse some of these negative trends. But in almost every instance, the governor has been an obstacle to getting those solutions adopted. And not just an obstacle, but sort of just removed and aloof from the conversation, like not physically in the Capitol when session is happening and legislators are trying to broker a compromise, but like off in Saudi Arabia, like falcon hunting or whatever. And I think it's just the approach and the style of like, I want to work together, I want to find common ground, I want to solve problems, I think is what Alaska really needs, and that's what I want to provide.
And that's my next question. Working with the state legislature is obviously key as a governor to pass your agenda, especially if it's in a majority that you don't hold or are subscribed to. So tell me a little bit about your approach to working with the legislature.
I think very similar to my time as a legislator. I prided myself in working across party lines. I chaired a committee for 6 years. Something I was took great intention of doing as a committee chair is making sure that the first piece of legislation I heard every legislature was a minority Republican bill. Not another Democrat, not somebody from my own caucus, but I wanted to demonstrate as a committee chair, like, good ideas are good ideas. I'm not going to run a partisan committee. I want this to be fair. I want to sort of serve the institution more broadly. And I like to feel that I earn trust and respect and goodwill from my colleagues, not just people in my own bipartisan coalition, but Republicans across the aisle. And I think that's exactly how I would want to govern as governor.
And then working with the presidential administration could also be key to passing some Alaska-centric provisions, whether that's just from a bureaucracy, but also making it clear, if you need to get something to the president to get passed forward onto Congress, working with that administration could be key. Obviously, we have somewhat of a controversial president, President Donald Trump, and certainly, I'm sure, not someone that you would agree with as a Democrat. So tell me how you work with the presidential administration to pass, make sure there's a relationship that's workable for Alaska.
Yeah, no fan of Trump. You got that right. I feel, unfortunately, the country is also probably not going in the right direction. But I'm not a bomb thrower or a grenade thrower, and I want to be pragmatic. And I feel like, Lisa and Mary, neither of whom is also, a huge fan of the president, have worked together when necessary to advance Alaska priorities. I think as governor, I'd have that same pragmatic approach. And also when, there are fundamental rights, freedoms, and liberties on the line for Alaskans, for instance, the integrity of our voter rolls being, solicited by the Department of Justice, or anything else that would impinge on Alaska's rights and liberties as provided under the Alaska Constitution, like that's the red line, and that's when you step up as governor and sort of take a hard stand, and I would do that.
Let's move over to some of the policy issues. I'll ask you about some of the top issues on the ballot this election, but why don't you first tell me a little bit about what you consider your top issue going into November? Into August, but into November too.
Supporting our schools. Schools in Alaska, I think, are the number one issue, and it touches every community, every school district I've been to, crisscrossing the state. There's a different sad story about what is unfolding if schools aren't outright closing. You have sports and electives being cut. You have some of the best teachers teaching in Alaska. either leaving the profession or leaving Alaska, go teach in the lower 48. And it's a crisis, and we have to address it as a first order of business. In addition to that, I'm really focused on the cost of living, and I think cost of energy and electricity in particular is something the state has real ability to address and lower those costs with Alaskans. I believe in wholesale investment in renewable energy and diversifying our energy sources and being more energy independent. So whatever chaos is happening in the Middle East isn't making our gas and electric bills go up 50% year over year. And lastly, fisheries and salmon, and our relationship with fisheries is, across Alaska, a common sort of cultural denominator. And there's too much bycatch. I think Alaskans have lost faith in the fisheries management process, and I want to rein in bycatch, and I want to make sure that Alaskans' voices really sort of call the shots at the tables at Board of Fish and the North Pacific Council.
Yeah. Let's go to economy, and there's obviously a lot of questions with the economy, but you mentioned the big one, affordability. Everyone feels it, everybody sees it, whether it's at the grocery store or at the gas station. It's pretty hard to pay for the cost of living at this point. So tell me what you can do as a governor to make sure that Alaskans aren't feeling the pinch. And obviously there's a lot of different disparities between where we're talking right here in Anchorage versus what people may be feeling in Bethel or even more remote communities.
Yeah. In the coming years, the state is going to pass what's called a general obligation bond. And this happens, every 10 to 20 years. It's probably going to be about $750 million. The last general obligation bond was $475 million. It was passed in 2012. And we've just about paid down the debt service on that bond. So this upcoming general obligation bond, this is the opportunity where we make generational investments in the state's future. Investments far bigger than any 1 year's capital budget can afford. And for me, the first and highest priority in that bond, in that set of huge capital projects that are going to reshape Alaska's future, is energy. And we should be investing in utility scale, renewable energy, energy storage, transmission infrastructure, all investments that will have a direct relationship to lowering the cost of energy and ultimately the cost of living for families and businesses both. And energy, it affects everyone, and this is a way the state can directly tackle that affordability crisis. And those projects should be both on the rail belt and in rural Alaska, both.
So let's ask about energy and resource development, obviously critical for our state's economy. The cost of oil, this is no stranger to you, but the cost of oil makes a significant amount of the budget, and that has been declining over time. It's also a very volatile resource. We've been seeing that in the cost because of this war in Iran. So tell me a little bit how you just list out some policy proposals you have when it comes to energy and resource development. You were just mentioning a few there.
Yeah. So I think the state needs to make a generational capital investment in renewable energy infrastructure across Alaska. Hydro, wind, solar, battery storage, which complements, of course, renewable sources of energy, although hydro in its own way is a type of energy storage. Also transmission infrastructure, which has to be paid for. So even if you have the energy sources, you need that sort of intermediate infrastructure to get those electrons into homes and businesses. I'm also a big believer in the potential of plug-in solar. And this is maybe not sort of a widely known form of technology, but it's been broadly adopted in Germany. And it's literally just a solar panel that you put on your porch and you plug into your house. And it produces energy, and on a one-to-one basis, it displaces energy that you otherwise have to buy from the utility off the grid. And I think the state of Alaska making plug-in solar available to Alaskans, almost like the PFD. Everybody gets a PFD. Everybody gets plug-in solar, like a solar panel you can put on your porch that is just going to knock down your electric bill from the moment you plug it in, I think is really compelling. And given the immediacy of the energy crisis, in particular on the rail belt with natural gas supplies dwindling, I think ideas like that are kind of out of the box and creative, like let's go, let's do it, let's bet that, let's see if it works, and if it works, let's do it.
And you mentioned that energy concern and crisis, looming crisis with natural gas for the rail belt. I know South Central is also very anxious about the future of Cook Inlet gas as well. So we have this proposal for a potentially generational pipeline. It's been proposed for 50 years. Again, I know you're no stranger to this.
There was a pipeline proposal when I first got to the legislature too.
I have no doubt.
Every 10 years.
I have no doubt. So why don't you tell me a little bit about this one? Obviously, when we're talking, we're a week out from potentially more news coming out. There's currently a third special session. But you have this bill that's kind of in play. What that's ultimately going to look like, we're still getting ideas for. So I'm not trying to pin you into what this current moment is, because that could change by the time this comes out. But tell me a little bit about your thoughts about this gas line. Do you think it's really as close as people are making out to be? And you know, if this does come to fruition, or if a plan doesn't get passed, it could be up to your administration to get a gas line.
Yeah, I strongly support a gas line. I mean, it would be transformational for the state. Jobs, GDP, new revenue to the state treasury that in turn can support schools and roads. I mean, I think with this current proposal, restructuring Alaska's tax structure, I think is an appropriate conversation. And I think the legislature has acted on that and, you know, effectively dramatically cut property taxes sort of in exchange for tax revenue that would happen later on after the project is built. So I support that. In addition, I think it's really important that as we Alaskans are making these concessions to our tax structure, that there is full and appropriate transparency on the project and what the project developer, Glenfarne, wants to do and how they're going to do it. And I would say I've been disappointed at times with the lack of transparency about the project and sort of frequently citing sort of confidentiality or sort of other reasons why I think fairly basic information can't be shared with the public, much less shared with legislators. And I think that starkly contrasts with when BP, Conoco, and Exxon were putting serious money into developing a pipeline about 10 years ago when I was in the legislature. And it was very straightforward. There was no claims of confidentiality or sort of project competitiveness as a way to decline to provide information. And so I take note of that, and I think it's really important that there is transparency about the project, especially if the state is going to make such dramatic changes to its policy.
Yeah, and then there's also this question of a long-term fiscal plan. Obviously, our fiscal future is somewhat uncertain. Again, this gas line, whether it will or won't happen, is uncertain. What the price of oil will yield future projects, it's somewhat uncertain, and what that looks like is, again, just uncertain. So why don't you tell me, do you have a long-term fiscal plan kind of laid out? The governor had one. It included a seasonal sales tax that didn't have any traction in the legislature. So do you have any proposals for a long-term fiscal plan?
Yeah, I think the first and most important thing is actually legislation that I proposed as a legislator, which is continue to get traction and move in the legislature since I left in 2022. And I think the first and most important piece to our fiscal plan is making sure our permanent fund is, in fact, truly permanent. And it's not well known, but large parts of the permanent fund are actually vulnerable to simple majority appropriation and could be overspent by billions of dollars tomorrow if there was sort of that impulse or urge. And I felt really strongly that we need to constitutionally protect the entirety of the permanent fund from overspending. And I think that accomplishes two things. Number one, it makes sure the permanent fund can grow with time. It can be permanent. It can be this sort of cornerstone in Alaska's future, which is what it is. And number two, by constitutionally protecting the permanent fund from overspending, I think it also sort of reduces the political complexity on the really tough questions of the budget and revenues and sort of the other fiscal questions that have really bedeviled Alaska. And by sort of putting the permanent fund like off the table as like a source of like getting easy cash, which at least in my time, there were many attempts to try to grab extra cash out of the permanent fund as a way to kind of avoid the harder questions. I think it's much more likely that we can actually broker a compromise on the tough budget questions that are before us.
Yeah. Economic diversification is another buzzword I've heard a lot from candidates when it comes to the future of our economy, potentially bringing a new industry to really flourish in Alaska, to help out the economy in Alaska. Are there any industries that you're particularly think could really have a great chance of flourishing here in the state?
I think as governor, as an elected official, you really want to follow cues that are existing in the private sector. And when there is organic job growth and when there are private investment dollars flowing into certain sectors, you should take note of that. And then you should do everything possible to sort of help amplify and accelerate that success and momentum. I think that's in contrast to just saying like, oh, we don't have anything whatsoever going on in a certain sector, but we're just going to like will it into existence. And usually I think that ends up being a misadventure and results in a lot of wasted public money. So that's kind of my philosophy. And to directly answer your question about specific sectors that I think have potential for Alaska, where we are seeing a lot of momentum, logistics and cargo here in Anchorage, but also Fairbanks, which is getting increasing amounts of freight traffic given our geostrategic location on the Great Circle route. An incredible amount of investment. I think very few Alaskans appreciate how many jobs are generated by the cargo and logistics industry in Anchorage and Fairbanks. Value-added seafood processing. I have a real deep fisheries background, and I think there's tremendous amount of value in our fisheries industry, and also a lot of that value leaves Alaska almost as soon as it possibly can. And supporting entrepreneurs and investments that are getting more value from our seafood resource in state, that is really exciting to me, and I think there's some positive momentum. Mariculture is another. And the last I would flag is tourism. And again, sort of tourism has been growing, which I think has been great for Alaska, but also thinking about how we can get, just as with seafood and fisheries, more value from our tourism industry. And I think there's some really great proof points. In Fairbanks right now, you can't rent a car in March in the winter because Fairbanks and the interior have done such a good job of marketing winter tourism. And I think that is something all of Alaska should sort of be striving to scale and replicate, which is year-round, including winter tourism, a focus on independent tourists, and the economic value of both of those sort of aspects of tourism, I think, have a lot of upside for the state, and we should pursue.
And then data centers, I know, are also somewhat of a flashpoint in this current moment as AI is also beginning to boom. Where do you kind of stand on data centers? I know there's a lot of concern about specifically environmental impact on those too.
I'm the first candidate to propose a moratorium on data center development in Alaska, at least until the legislature can pass comprehensive regulation that protect the public interest on data center development. And I have a background in science and technology policy, so this is something I have been particularly closely following. And again, first candidate to propose a moratorium on data center development, because I think we have to get ahead of the curve on this kind of development, which can have adverse impacts on Alaskans. I think there's a lot of concern from across the political spectrum, just like not knowing how this could affect their communities or their electric bill. So that is why we are the first candidate to propose a moratorium on data center development.
And a few more questions, kind of switching gears now to public safety. I know there's a lot of public safety concerns, I'm thinking not only in Anchorage, but also lots of different, very, very different public safety concerns around the state. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your approach to public safety as governor?
Yeah, the core state responsibility, as with education, is making sure there's reasonable funding so you can have troopers and VPSOs in communities providing law enforcement. And unsurprisingly, things start going to heck when you just don't have a law enforcement response because you've underfunded the agencies respectively. And in the world more generally, it's always a lot of doom and gloom, and it kind of feels like there's just problems everywhere. But I also think it's worth highlighting when there's success stories. And in the last number of years, because of legislative leadership, there's been increased funding in the VPSO program, and the stats on rural law enforcement, it's still a very tough area, but they've gotten relatively better. VPSO retention, responses to incidents, there is some positive success there, and I want to build on that. And I think the VPSO program in rural Alaska is notable because it's also often a partnership between tribes and local government and the state. And it's, I think, sort of making things better than it otherwise would be. And with state troopers on a state level, it's just a question of funding. And I have a little bit of a personal perspective. My running mate is a former state trooper, served for the better part of a decade, and so it's a core state responsibility.
Yeah. Last policy question, ranked choice voting. It's on the ballot this year. Alaskans will get to decide if they want ranked choice voting going forward. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on ranked choice voting.
I support our open primary ranked choice voting system. And I mean, I'd actually really emphasize the open primary part because I think it promotes competition. You don't have to be, in a certain sort of party mold. You can be an independent. And I think that sort of promoting competition in the political process is really, really important. And the system has clearly provided that. And the results are very clear in the legislature, where you have Ds and Is and Rs working together in ways that are unprecedented nationally. And I think that's a positive. And I think the last reason I'd note I support the current system and voting against the initiative coming up is the dark money provisions that would be repealed. I think that's bad. Like, transparency is good for Alaskans, and that, I think, just gives me that much more reason to vote against the initiative.
And you mentioned competition. There's certainly no dearth of competition in the race you're running right now as well.
Yes, 17 of us.
Yes. So let's, last few questions, moving away from policy. Jonathan Kreiss-Tomkins, why should Alaskans vote for you?
To put the Dunleavy era in the rearview mirror and get new energy and new ideas in the governor's office.
My final question, what does it mean to be Alaskan?
I think it means you care about your neighbors and you care about the future of the state. And, for me, I want Alaska to be a better, more prosperous place, for my children, for the next generation than it is for us. And I think that sort of paying it forward mentality is something that's really common across the state, regardless of what your politics are.
Former state legislator Jonathan Kreiss-Tomkins, JKT. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you so much.